Welcome back, it's Christopher, and in today's episode, I'm uncovering the worst animal death ever recorded. From a student who poked a black mamba and triggered a lethal chain reaction, to a tourist who leaned in toward a tiger's muzzle, chasing the perfect photo and paid for her actions in the worst way possible. It was February 2nd, 2018, at Whitmore Station in far north Queensland, and the wet season heat had already broken 85 degrees before 7 in the morning when the sequence of decisions began that would leave paramedics focusing on the wrong thing. Bartholomew Bart Whitmore, 60, had operated the family cattle station in the Cardwell Shire for 31 years following his father's death. He was regarded in the local agricultural community as capable and direct, but also as someone who pushed seasonal workers hard and dismissed concerns from those he considered below his authority. The station ran lean and cycled through more casual labor than most comparable operations in the region. Based on what I've read, people said that he had a reputation not for cruelty, but for a total intolerance of what he called unnecessary hesitation. But I think they're just sugarcoating it. That morning, he had put a young backpacker named Jack to work clearing tall Mitchell grass along the eastern fence line, an area with dense patches of Mitchell grass, scrub, and rodent burrows known to attract taipans. Jack had no protective gear and no bush experience. After 40 minutes, he walked back to Bart and reported definite coastal taipan signs in the area. Shed skins, disturbed rodent burrows near fence posts, and partially hidden flattened grass patches, suggesting a snake had passed. He left the property shortly after. Simon Drew, a farmhand from the neighboring station, watched the exchange from across the boundary fence. The coastal taipan is one of the most venomous snakes in the world. Adults in far north Queensland commonly exceed 6 feet, with some over 7. Its presynaptic neurotoxin disrupts nerve-to-muscle communication, causing paralysis that becomes irreversible past a threshold. Severe bites can lead to respiratory failure in 30 to 90 minutes without antivenom. Strikes are fast, and the snake usually withdraws immediately, leaving only a sharp sting with no early warning of the venom's effect. Before Bart entered the grass, Simon called across and relayed what Jack had told him. Bart did not respond. He walked into the Mitchell grass, swinging the machete in low lateral arcs at knee height, precisely the opposite of the careful, high-stepping approach that anyone experienced in taipan country would use by instinct. Simon watched for a short time, then returned to his own work. The report said that he likely stepped on it. The post-mortem placed the bite on Bart's lower right calf, 2 puncture marks, 3/4 of an inch apart, consistent with a large adult taipan. The snake had likely struck and immediately withdrawn. Simon did not see the bite. What he saw, minutes later, was Bart walking quickly back toward the equipment shed, cursing audibly, moving with visible agitation. Bart apparently climbed into his truck and drove off down the internal station road. Simon assumed he had cut himself on the blade. He did not follow. The neurotoxins were already crossing into his neuromuscular junctions, silently dismantling the acetylcholine, signaling that kept his muscles responding to his brain's commands. In taipan envenomation, fine motor control deteriorates before gross motor function. Fingers first, then grip, then larger coordinated movement. His foot would have grown heavy on the accelerator, and steering increasingly awkward. Loss of coordination and mild slurred speech would have started within 15 to 20 minutes after the bite, with severe weakness by 30 minutes. According to eyewitnesses, the truck drifted from the internal road at under 20 miles per hour and struck a timber utility pole on the eastern boundary. The engine kept running. By the time the truck stopped, Bart was incapable of purposeful movement. Respiratory muscles were failing rapidly, but a few shallow breaths were still possible. Presynaptic neurotoxins, once they have disrupted the nerve terminals past a structural threshold, do not respond to antivenom. His chest muscles were failing. Each breath was likely shallower than the one before it. He slumped forward against the wheel. Maria Parada, a contract laborer driving toward the station on the adjacent access road, heard the collision and found Bart slumped against the wheel, minimally responsive. She called emergency services at 8:43 a.m. Paramedics arrived in 15 minutes and initially assessed him for crash injuries, suspected head trauma, possible chest impact. The bite on his calf was not identified until he was being moved for transport. I feel bad for the responders because they were faced with the problem they were not prepared for. They likely did things correctly, by the book, and yet they were missing the killer. The neurotoxin progression was already at a point generally considered irreversible for presynaptic paralysis. He was declared dead at 9:31 a.m. Post-mortem findings. Primary cause of death, envenomation by Oxyuranus scutellatus, coastal taipan. Secondary finding, blunt force trauma, consistent with vehicle collision. The cattle station itself was sold several months later. They changed ownership, and the new proprietors opted to restructure operations entirely. The seasonal and casual workers who had been employed under Bart were laid off, leaving many without immediate employment or housing arrangement. As much as Bart was to blame in the story, he still provided jobs for multiple people. I just wish he was kinder to them. Then maybe I'd feel bad for his demise. It was July 27th, 2018, at Lake Naivasha in Nakuru County, Kenya, late afternoon. The water looked still. Along the shoreline, thick papyrus reeds and floating vegetation lined the edges. It is a freshwater lake, known for a significant hippopotamus population. Ava Bennett, 19, was from Austin, Texas. She ran a travel vlog on social media, with around 2,100 followers. Her content was built around filming herself in unfamiliar places and recording her reactions in real time. She had ridden through heavy traffic in Lagos without a helmet while filming. She had eaten unidentified street food in Hanoi and documented what happened next. Neither had ended badly. Each video had added followers. The pattern was the same every time. Go into something unfamiliar, come out the other side, post it. Lake Naivasha was her third stop on a self-funded East Africa trip. And look, I actually spent time going back through her content when I was researching this case. The Lagos video is genuinely compelling. She had a real eye for it, which is part of what makes this so hard to read. She arrived at the lake in the afternoon and found a small independent vendor near the shore who rented out kayaks. The vendor told her the area near the reeds was not safe for paddling and recommended a guide to take her further out into open water. She declined. She pushed off alone. At established lodges on Lake Naivasha, guests are routinely advised to avoid shoreline vegetation, maintain distance from reed beds, and not enter the water without a guide. Those guidelines exist because hippopotamuses spend the day submerged in shallow water along the edges of the lake, often directly beneath the surface, with no visible sign of their position. And this is the part that gets me. The guide was offered. It was right there. She said no and paddled out alone. Ava paddled toward the densest section of vegetation along the shoreline. There were signs, subtle movement in the water near the reeds, a disturbance that did not match wind or current. She did not interpret them as anything significant. The surface looked calm. She treated it as confirmation. She had entered the animal's space before she understood that it was occupied. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large animals in Africa. They are highly territorial in water and will respond aggressively to anything that enters their space. They spend the day submerged in shallow water, often near reed beds, and typically surface every few minutes to breathe, meaning a large animal can sit directly below a small boat with nothing visible on the surface. A large adult can weigh over 3,000 pounds, with large canine teeth capable of inflicting severe crushing and puncture injuries, and bite force sufficient to crush bone. In water, an encounter can occur without any visible warning, and often with little to no time to react. I have been obsessed with hippo behavior since I covered a river guide case like this a few weeks ago, and what I can tell you is that the reed line is where you never go. Every guide on that lake knows it. Ava just did not have a guide. A caption had been saved on her phone, but not yet posted. It read, "Nature is so peaceful. If you know, you know." She paddled further into the area. Her phone was mounted on the kayak, recording, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. She was still speaking to her camera when the animal surfaced directly beneath the kayak. The force of it threw the kayak sideways and flipped it. Ava hit the water and came up in the same space as the animal. The hippo drove into her immediately. The first bite closed on her lower torso. The canines drove through soft tissue and into the underlying structure with enough force to fracture the pelvis and damage internal organs on contact. She was pulled under briefly, then released. She surfaced, but could not move. Witnesses on the shoreline saw what happened and raised the alarm. Local responders were contacted and reached the area. She was pulled from the water. She was alive, but her injuries were severe. She was transported to the nearest medical facility. Staff received her in critical condition and initiated emergency intervention, including fluid resuscitation and attempts to stabilize internal injuries. However, the extent of pelvic trauma and internal organ damage, combined with prolonged blood loss and delayed access to advanced surgical care, had already led to irreversible shock. Despite continued efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She was declared dead shortly after arrival. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be hemorrhagic shock due to traumatic injuries sustained in a hippopotamus attack. Local authorities documented the incident and reiterated safety guidance regarding shoreline navigation without a guide. The vendor reported that a warning had been given, though this could not be independently confirmed. Ava's body was repatriated to the United States. Her family held a funeral in Austin. Her social media accounts were later archived, and I will say it plainly, nature is so peaceful, but don't get in the bad side of it. Ava did and paid the price. It was September 3rd, 2016, at a small private bush lodge on the unfenced boundary of a wildlife conservancy in southern Africa. Just after 3 a.m., no moon, air around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The lodge had a rear deck that faced out toward a natural waterhole roughly 90 feet from the back of the building. During the day, that waterhole was a selling point. At night, it was completely invisible, and I think that distinction matters more than it might seem. Peter Vandermeer was 47, an accountant from Rotterdam, traveling with his wife on a 2-week safari package, their first time in sub-Saharan Africa. By most accounts, he was not an adventurous man. He had booked the trip through a travel agent, stuck to the scheduled activities, and had been perfectly content to experience the bush from the back of a vehicle. He had also quit smoking 3 years before the trip. By the second day, he had bought a pack. If the craving had hit him at noon instead of 3 a.m., I genuinely believe he would have made it home. But it didn't, and what he did instead is the reason we're talking about him at all. At dinner that evening, the lodge manager had addressed all guests directly. Lion activity had been recorded near the waterhole on 3 consecutive nights. Guests were not to leave the main building after dark without a staff escort. Not suggested, told. Peter's wife reminded him of this when he got up at 3 a.m. He nodded, picked up his phone, turned on the torch, and put it back down on the nightstand. He found his sandal, wedged it under the rear screen door so it wouldn't latch behind him, and walked out barefoot, into the dark with nothing in his hands. No light, no shoes, no phone, in lion country, at 3 a.m. I don't know what a person has to believe about their own safety to make those choices, but whatever it was, Peter believed it completely. He stopped at the edge of the deck, roughly 55 feet from the water's edge, and lit his cigarette. The waterhole was completely dark. He could not see it from where he stood. He could not see anything beyond the edge of the deck. If I had been standing there, no shoes, no light, no phone, in a place I'd been explicitly warned about less than 6 hours earlier, I'd like to think something would have told me to go back inside. But I also know that's easy to say from here. That detail about the phone is the one I keep returning to. He had a light source in his hand, and he put it down. That single moment shifts this from a story about compounding misjudgments into something much harder to explain. It wasn't that he didn't have the tools to be safer. He had one right there. He just chose not to take it. The conservancy the lodge bordered was not a fenced reserve. There was no barrier between that deck and the open bush beyond it. Animals moved through that land on their own schedules, on routes that had existed long before the lodge was built. The waterhole was a fixed point on one of those routes, which is exactly why the lodge had been positioned to face it. 3 consecutive nights of lion activity at that waterhole was not a coincidence or an anomaly. It was a pattern, and when I look at it that way, Peter wasn't stepping out into an unknown risk. He was stepping into a known one, at the worst possible hour, having actively chosen not to bring the one thing that might have made a difference. The lodge had no exterior lighting on the rear deck side. The path from the door to the deck edge was unlit. I don't raise that to shift responsibility. Peter had been told not to go outside, full stop. But it does mean that from the moment he stepped through that door, he was operating in conditions where he could not have detected a threat at any meaningful distance. He was effectively blind beyond 10 feet. The waterhole was invisible. Whatever was at it was invisible, and he stood there for 9 minutes. The African lion is most active between midnight and 4 a.m. Adult females, the primary hunters, typically weigh between 270 and 400 pounds and can cover 30 feet in under a second. They do not vocalize before a predatory approach. A lone human in low light, standing still and then suddenly crouching, presents a silhouette and movement pattern consistent with isolated prey. That last part matters because of what Peter did next. After approximately 9 minutes outside, he crouched down near the base of the deck post to stub his cigarette out against the ground. A small movement, the kind nobody thinks twice about. The lioness had already crossed the waterhole and was moving through the low grass on the near side. No sound, no warning. Track evidence recovered. The following morning placed her at approximately 35 feet from Peter at the moment he crouched. She covered that distance in under 2 seconds. When I read that, 35 feet, under 2 seconds, I had to pause. By the time his knee touched the ground, she was already moving. First contact was a bite to the back of the neck and left shoulder, consistent with a predatory approach targeting the cervical region. Peter was driven forward off the edge of the deck onto the dirt path below, a drop of about 18 inches. The impact knocked his sandal free from the screen door. The door swung shut and banged against the frame. His wife heard it. She called out twice. No response. She went to the adjacent staff room and knocked until someone answered. If she had gone to the door herself instead of calling out from inside, if she had stepped out even 30 seconds earlier, I don't know that it would have changed the outcome, but I find myself going there anyway, the way you do with these stories when the margins are that thin. Staff reached the rear deck 6 to 7 minutes later. Peter was found face down in the dirt, 18 feet from the base of the deck. The lioness had withdrawn into the bush. Nothing moving, nothing visible beyond the reach of the flashlights. Just Peter, face down, and the dark pressing in on every side. The nearest medical facility was 38 miles away on an unpaved road. Response reached the lodge approximately 95 minutes after the attack. Cause of death was cervical trauma and blood loss consistent with a large felid attack. The bite to the posterior neck was the determining injury. Track evidence confirmed a single adult female lion approaching from the waterhole direction. Peter's cigarette butt and the displaced sandal were both documented at the scene. The lioness was tracked the following morning by Conservancy rangers. She was identified and monitored, but not destroyed. The attack was assessed as predatory opportunism rather than habituated aggression, and Conservancy policy does not provide for removal on that basis. The lodge conducted an internal review. The case was closed as a death by wildlife encounter. What the review could not resolve was the layering of it, the warning at dinner, the wife's reminder at 3 a.m., the phone left on the nightstand, the sandal wedged under the door. 9 minutes on that deck, barefoot, in complete darkness, 55 feet from a waterhole flagged 3 nights running. If any single one of those held, if he had taken the phone, if the craving had passed, if he had simply turned around, the sequence breaks, but none of them held. And that is the part of this story that doesn't get easier the more you look at it. It was July 11th, 2016. The dry season had reduced the river to a slow, shallow channel, its banks wide and exposed where the water had pulled back from the wet season's high mark. The afternoon heat was still significant, the kind of dry, pressing warmth that sits over southern African river systems in the middle of the year, when the sky is cloudless and the light falls flat and direct across the water. There was no wind. The surface of the river was largely still, broken only by the slow movement of the current and the occasional disturbance from animals along the bank. The exposed, sandy banks on both sides of the channel were broad and pale in the afternoon light, and the vegetation behind them had thinned with the dry season, leaving the riverine tree line open and visible from the water. Aaron Blake was 28 years old, a freelance travel photographer from London who had been working across southern Africa for several months. He had built a modest but growing portfolio of wildlife and landscape work over the previous 2 years, taking assignments from travel publications and licensing images through a small agency that handled editorial placements. The work required images that stood out, shots that conveyed proximity and intimacy with subjects that most photographers captured from a distance. Aaron had internalized that requirement. He had brought his own camera equipment on the guided boat tour, a longer lens setup mounted on a body that performed well in bright conditions, and he had positioned himself near the front of the vessel for most of the excursion, frequently leaning outward over the bow to extend his shooting angle beyond the edge of the boat. The tour had departed in the early afternoon with several passengers. The guide had conducted a standard safety briefing before departure, covering the rules of the excursion clearly. Passengers were to remain seated and centered in the vessel at all times. Leaning over the sides was not permitted. Approaching wildlife independently or altering position without instruction was not permitted. The briefing was standard and thorough. For the first portion of the excursion, the group moved along the river without incident. Aaron photographed from his position near the front of the boat, adjusting his angle within the vessel and capturing images of birds, crocodiles on the banks, and the river landscape. The guide maintained a steady pace and positioned the boat at appropriate distances from the animals they encountered. At around 4:10 p.m., the boat approached a group of hippos, partially submerged near the riverbank. Several animals were visible at the waterline, their backs and heads breaking the surface in the shallow water close to the bank. Others were submerged, their positions marked only by the slow rise of their backs and the occasional movement of an ear or nostril. The guide positioned the vessel at a safe observation distance and held that position, cutting the engine to reduce noise and disturbance. Aaron moved to the front edge of the boat. He extended his upper body outward over the bow, leaning past the edge of the vessel to bring his lens closer to the animals. The guide directed him to return to a seated position. Aaron adjusted slightly, but remained at the front of the boat, his weight forward and his center of balance extended beyond the hull. I understand the instinct. He was chasing the shot of a lifetime, but I think part of him stopped hearing the risk the moment he looked through that lens. One of the hippos performed a yawn display. The animal opened its jaws wide, holding the posture for several seconds, the full extent of its canine teeth visible above the waterline. This behavior is among the most well-documented warning signals in hippopotamus territorial communication. It is not a passive or ambiguous gesture. It is a direct indicator of agitation, a signal that the animal has registered the presence of the perceived threat and is communicating its readiness to escalate. In field research and guide training across southern African river systems, the yawn display is treated as an immediate cue to increase distance. The animal that displays in this way has already moved past passive tolerance. The guide identified the display immediately and directed the group to hold position. He did not advance the boat. He assessed the animal's behavior and prepared to move the vessel back from its current position. Seconds after the display concluded, the hippo surged forward through the water. The charge covered the distance between the animal's position and the front of the boat rapidly. The hippo came in from the side, its jaws driving into the hull near the bow, with enough force to send a violent shock through the length of the vessel. The strike was not a clean, direct impact. It was the kind of sideways, wrenching contact that a large animal makes when it is biting and pushing at once, the hull flexing under a force it was not designed to absorb. Common hippopotamuses are among Africa's most dangerous large animals, responsible for a significant number of human fatalities each year across the continent's river systems. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. Their territorial aggression in water is not predatory in the conventional sense. They do not attack to feed. They attack to remove a perceived threat from their territory, and they sustain that aggression for as long as the threat, or the disturbance the threat generates, remains present. The hippo resurfaced in the same area almost immediately after Aaron entered the water. The water around the point of impact churned violently as the animal continued to react to the disturbance at the surface. The boat's position relative to the animal and the continued agitation in the water made any approach to retrieve Aaron from the vessel impossible without placing the boat and its remaining passengers in direct proximity to the animal. The encounter lasted less than a minute from the moment Aaron entered the water. Less than a minute. I don't think that ever gets easier to read. The investigation that followed examined the sequence of events in detail. Aaron had repositioned himself to the front edge of the vessel against the guide's explicit instructions during the briefing, and against the guide's direction during the approach to the pod. He had extended his body outside the boat's center of balance, placing himself in a position where any sudden movement of the vessel would compromise his footing. He had remained in that position after a clear and unambiguous warning display from the animal, a display that the guide had identified in real time and that represented a well-understood escalation signal. The time between the yawn display and the charge had been a matter of seconds, insufficient for any corrective action once the animal had committed. No criminal negligence was found against the operator or the guide. The investigation concluded that the guide had conducted the briefing appropriately, had identified the warning display correctly, and had not advanced the vessel into the pod. The finding was accidental death. The operator subsequently revised its passenger positioning protocols for close-range wildlife observation, implementing physical barriers at the bow of its vessels to prevent passengers from extending beyond the hull's edge during wildlife approaches. It was September 22, 2017, in Kenya's Masai Mara National Reserve, where golden grass stretched across the plains under a crisp morning sky. A pride of lions lay scattered among termite mounds, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Jovel Terrado, 26, was a Filipina living in Dubai, working full-time as a dental hygienist while building her social media presence. She had just over 14,000 followers and was deeply invested in creating content that could grow her platform. She had no formal wildlife experience, no prior safari trip, and relied entirely on what she had seen online. It's surprising how fast curiosity and wanting something more can get someone into trouble in the wild. Even a careful person can be in serious danger from just one choice. The first 2 days passed without incident. Jovel filmed constant, narrating her experience with energy, but the footage lacked the dramatic edge she wanted. By the second evening, she expressed frustration to her friend Dina, seeking something more visually striking. On the morning of September 22nd, the group returned to a spot where a lion pride had been seen seen the day before, about 120 meters away and partly hidden. The guide, Elijah Kosuke, made it clear no one should leave the vehicle. Jovel asked to step out for a walking shot, ignoring repeated warnings and citing online videos. Even I also wanted to step out sometimes for a better angle, thinking I could handle it. And reading this really makes me realize how quickly that confidence can become deadly. While Elijah briefly stepped out to check a tire, she quietly opened her door, handed her phone to a friend, and walked several meters into the grass. A male lion, lying flat behind a termite mound 40 meters away, saw her isolated movement and instantly triggered its ambush instinct. Once the charge began, escape was nearly impossible. The lion struck from behind, knocking her to the ground with full force. The initial impact incapacitated her immediately. In the same sequence, the lion secured a bite at the back of her neck and upper spine. The motion was precise and controlled, causing instant collapse of motor function. Her body went still within seconds. Even imagining that moment makes my stomach drop. Just a few seconds, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The lion shifted slightly to maintain a throat hold, while pinning her to the ground. There was no prolonged struggle, no hesitation. The animal remained calm and deliberate. By the time Elijah reached her, the critical phase was complete. A warning shot caused the lion to release and retreat back to the pride. Jovel was unresponsive. Medical assessment later determined death occurred in less than a minute due to spinal trauma and suffocation. She had been outside the vehicle for under 90 seconds. This timeline highlights how fast irreversible outcomes can happen, faster than most people can process in real time. Emergency services followed protocol, but intervention was impossible once the attack began. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Investigators confirmed the guide was not responsible. He had denied all requests to exit the vehicle. The lion was not destroyed, acting in line with natural predatory behavior. Even I sometimes feel tempted to step out for a better view or shot, but in predator areas I've learned that the vehicle isn't just a convenience, it's your lifeline. Once you leave it, you're instantly exposed, and no amount of warnings can physically stop a sudden move. Following the rules completely, every time, is the only way to stay safe. Jovel's body was returned to the Philippines, where her family held a private funeral. Her social media accounts remained unchanged, her final post still visible from the night before, captioned with anticipation for the next day. What remains is the quiet series of ordinary choices, moving outside the vehicle, seeking a better shot, that combine in seconds to create a fatal outcome.
It was September 9th, 2016, when the first hints of autumn colored the forests of Glacier National Park, Montana. The air was crisp, and the mountains stood tall against a sky streaked with early morning clouds. The park's dense stands of pine and aspen were alive with the sounds of birds and the distant rush of glacial streams. Victoria Langford, 28, had arrived the previous day, eager to spend a weekend alone in the backcountry. She was a marketing manager for an outdoor gear company, experienced in hiking and camping, and had come to Glacier to create promotional content for her company's new line of bear spray. Victoria's confidence in the outdoors was well known among her friends and colleagues. She had completed several solo hikes in the past and often posted about her adventures on social media. Her company encouraged her to document her trips, hoping her photos and videos would inspire others to explore the wild. Victoria planned to hike a remote trail along a salmon-rich stream, film herself using the new bear spray, and capture the park's rugged beauty for her followers. She packed light, carrying her camera, a tripod, and the bear spray, though she kept it in her backpack rather than on her belt where it would be easily accessible. The park was in the midst of the annual salmon run, a time when grizzly bears descended from the high country to feed along the streams. Rangers had posted warnings at trailheads, reminding hikers to make noise, travel in groups, and keep bear spray accessible at all times. Victoria, hiking alone, was aware of the risks but trusted her experience and the reliability of her gear. She moved quietly through the forest, pausing often to set up her camera and record the landscape. Her social media posts from previous trips showed a pattern of getting closer to wildlife than most experts would recommend, always in pursuit of that perfect shot. Grizzly bears are among North America's most powerful predators. Adult females can weigh up to 400 pounds, while males can exceed 600. Their muscular bodies, long claws, and keen sense of smell make them formidable hunters and scavengers. During the salmon run, grizzlies become especially active and territorial, often defending feeding sites from other bears and any perceived threats. A grizzly's charge can reach speeds of 30 miles per hour, and their bite force is strong enough to crush bone. Most attacks occur when a bear is surprised at close range or feels its cubs or food source are threatened. Mother bears with cubs are particularly dangerous, as their protective instincts override any natural wariness of humans. On the morning of September 9th, Victoria followed a narrow trail along a stream thick with spawning salmon. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and fish, and the sound of rushing water masked her footsteps. She paused to film a segment for her company, then continued deeper into the woods, her camera in hand. Around a bend, she spotted a female grizzly with 2 yearling cubs, all focused on the salmon in the water. Victoria stopped, quietly setting up her tripod to capture the scene. The bear, intent on fishing, was only about 30 feet away. Victoria, hoping for a dramatic shot that would showcase both the wildlife and her company's products, moved a few steps closer, camera raised. The grizzly's head lifted, nostrils flaring as she caught Victoria's scent. The bear's posture changed instantly, ears back, head low, and a deep huff breaking the quiet. The cubs scrambled up the bank behind their mother, sensing danger. Without warning, the grizzly charged. In less than 2 seconds, the 400-pound bear closed the distance, her powerful legs propelling her across the uneven ground with terrifying speed. Victoria had no time to reach for her bear spray buried deep in her backpack. The bear struck with her front paws, knocking Victoria to the ground with tremendous force. The impact fractured Victoria's ribs and collarbone, and the collision sent her camera skidding into the brush. The grizzly's claws, each nearly 4 inches long, raked across Victoria's torso, tearing through her jacket and into the muscle beneath. The bear bit down on Victoria's shoulder and upper chest, her massive jaws crushing bone and severing arteries. Blood pooled rapidly on the forest floor as the bear shook her victim. The grizzly continued the attack for nearly a minute, delivering several more blows and bites before retreating to her cubs, who watched from the safety of the trees. Victoria's injuries were catastrophic. The initial impact had broken multiple ribs and her collarbone, while the bear's claws and teeth caused deep lacerations and puncture wounds throughout her upper body. The bite to her chest severed the subclavian artery, leading to rapid and fatal blood loss. The massive trauma sent her body into shock, and within minutes, Victoria lost consciousness and died at the scene. Rangers responding to an emergency call from another hiker found Victoria's body later that morning. The area was immediately closed off, and wildlife officials began a thorough investigation, reviewing trail safety protocols and bear management procedures. The grizzly and her cubs were not relocated or destroyed, as the attack was determined to be defensive behavior, triggered by a perceived threat to the cubs and food source.
August 17, 2017, brought perfect conditions to the waters 25 miles off Marathon in the Florida Keys. The Gulf Stream current ran clear and blue, with visibility extending over 100 feet into the crystal-clear depths. The water temperature held steady at a comfortable 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexandra Alex Petrov, 31, had been looking forward to this deep training session for weeks. Alex was a legend in the freediving community, a world-ranked athlete who could dive to depths exceeding 200 feet on a single breath. Her lean, athletic build and intense focus had earned her multiple national records and the respect of freedivers worldwide. She had been teaching freediving for 8 years, running a successful school in Key Largo, where she trained hundreds of students. The waters off the Florida Keys represented some of the most challenging and rewarding freediving locations in the world. The proximity to the Gulf Stream brought clear, warm water and an abundance of pelagic species, but it also attracted some of the ocean's most dangerous predators. At 4:20 p.m., Alex was demonstrating deep, constant weight technique for an advanced student, preparing to descend to 180 feet. During her extended bottom time at 180 feet, Alex experienced shallow water blackout during her ascent, a condition where decreased oxygen levels cause unconsciousness as a freediver approaches the surface. When she finally broke the surface, gasping for air after the deep dive, she found herself 400 yards from her safety boat in unfamiliar water. What Alex didn't know was that she had surfaced directly in a feeding zone where a dead pilot whale calf had been floating for 2 days. The decomposing carcass had created a massive scent trail that attracted scavengers from miles around, including some of the ocean's most dangerous predators. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous predators in tropical and subtropical waters worldwide. These massive sharks can grow up to 18 feet in length and weigh over 1,400 pounds, making them one of the largest predatory sharks in the ocean. Their distinctive dark stripes, which give them their name, fade as they mature, but their reputation as indiscriminate killers only grows stronger with age. What makes tiger sharks particularly terrifying is their feeding behavior. They are often called the waste baskets of the sea because they will eat virtually anything they encounter. Their stomachs have been found to contain everything from sea turtles and seals to license plates, tires, and even human remains. This indiscriminate feeding behavior, combined with their massive size and powerful jaws, makes them extremely dangerous to humans. Tiger sharks possess incredibly powerful jaws, capable of delivering up to 1,050 pounds per square inch of crushing force. Their teeth are uniquely designed with a curved, serrated edge that can cut through the shells of sea turtles, the tough skin of other sharks, and even metal objects. A 14-foot female tiger shark had been feeding aggressively on the whale carcass and was in a heightened predatory state. The massive predator, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, had been gorging herself on the rich blubber and meat of the dead whale. When feeding on large carcasses, tiger sharks often become more aggressive and territorial, defending their food source against any perceived threats. Alex's rapid breathing and surface splashing after the deep dive attracted the shark's attention immediately. To the predator, the surface disturbance looked like a wounded or distressed animal, exactly the type of easy prey that tiger sharks are programmed to attack. The shark's lateral line system detected the water movements caused by Alex's breathing and arm movements, while her elevated heart rate after the deep dive created electrical signals that the shark could detect from a considerable distance. The massive predator approached from below, using the sun's glare on the surface to mask its approach until the final moment. Alex, still recovering from her deep dive and disoriented from the shallow water blackout, never saw the attack coming. The shark approached from below and grabbed Alex's torso in a single, devastating bite that showcased the full power of one of the ocean's most formidable predators. Massive jaws, capable of opening to a gape of nearly 2 feet, engulfed her midsection with crushing force. The serrated teeth sliced through her wetsuit and deep into her torso, crushing ribs and puncturing vital organs. The attack lasted approximately 30 seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. Tiger sharks are known for their powerful bite and thrashing behavior, using their muscular necks to cause maximum trauma to their prey. The shark's grip crushed Alex's ribcage and caused massive internal bleeding before it released her and disappeared into the depths. Her safety diver, searching frantically from the boat after losing sight of Alex during her ascent, heard her brief scream and located her within 3 minutes, but the damage had already been done. The shark's powerful jaws had crushed Alex's ribcage and punctured her lungs, liver, and other vital organs. Massive internal bleeding had already begun, and her body was going into shock from the trauma. Alex was pulled from the water and given immediate medical attention, but the damage was too severe. She died from massive internal trauma and blood loss before reaching shore. Her world-class athletic career ended by one of the ocean's most unpredictable predators. Investigation revealed that the whale carcass had created a feeding aggregation of multiple tiger sharks in the area, critical information that hadn't been communicated to local dive operators. The incident led to new protocols requiring marine wildlife surveys before deep diving operations.
It was August 17th, 2018, in Homestead, Florida. The Crocodile Farm off Chrome Avenue was running its midday tours, small groups moving along fenced walkways, while staff controlled the pace between stations. Signage was posted at every point to make the rules clear and ensure safety. Marilyn Hodge, 63, was a retired small business owner from Coral Springs. She had arrived that morning with her daughter and son-in-law, treating the visit as a casual outing. She had been to wildlife attractions before and considered herself comfortable around animals. Her daughter had mentioned on the drive over that the farm had strict rules about contact with the animals. Marilyn had said she understood, and look, that lasted about 40 minutes. Her daughter told her on the drive over, "I love that detail, because we all know someone who says they understand and means absolutely nothing by it." The tour moved through its early stations without incident. Marilyn asked questions at every stop, some of them reasonable and some of them directed at the guide in a way that made clear she considered his answers optional. At the midpoint, the guide brought the group to a controlled handling tank where a juvenile crocodile was being demonstrated. The animal was approximately 2 to 3 feet long and was being held by a trained handler who explained the correct grip and the reasons behind it. Juvenile crocodiles have the same bite reflex as adults, fully developed at birth. Even a 2-foot animal can exert enough pressure to break finger bones and draw serious blood. So, the facility did not permit visitors to handle them under any circumstances. The signs on the tank said so. The handler had just said so. None of that mattered to Marilyn. She asked to hold it. The guide told her it was not permitted under facility policy. Marilyn said she had handled reptiles before and was not concerned about the risk. She snapped at the guide and asked to speak to someone in charge. The farm manager came over, listened, gave the same answer the guide had already given twice, and returned to his other duties. Marilyn stayed at the tank, watching the juvenile, waiting for her moment. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. When the guide turned to answer a question from another visitor at the far end of the group, she reached into the tank and attempted to lift the juvenile herself. The animal bit her hand the moment she made contact. She dropped it reflexively. The juvenile fell into the inner service area beside the tank and began moving quickly toward a narrow internal drainage channel along the enclosure edge. The guide moved immediately to recover the animal. Marilyn looked at her hand briefly, saw the blood, and then looked back toward where the juvenile had gone. She was not thinking about her hand. She was thinking about the fact that she had just dropped a crocodile in front of a group of people, and she did not want to stand there looking like she had caused a problem. She wanted to find it first, and this is the part I find hardest to process. Her hand was bleeding. A crocodile had just bitten her, and her first thought was how it looked. The main enclosure held 11 adult Nile crocodiles. The largest was a 14-foot male, estimated at over 1,000 pounds, who had been at the facility for over a decade. Years of feeding routines had conditioned him to associate movement and sound at the railing with the arrival of food. He was already positioned near the water line when Marilyn reached the boundary marker. I spent a long time on this part of the research, trying to understand the layout of that enclosure. And what I found is that the boundary marker was not subtle. It was painted on the ground and posted at eye level. This section of the facility was older infrastructure, predating the 2011 renovation, and had never been brought fully in line with updated barrier standards. There was no secondary rail. The single railing sat closer to the waterline than it should have. She crossed it without stopping and leaned over the inner railing to look into the enclosure below, her upper body extending past the safety line as she scanned the water. The crocodile surged upward from the water's edge almost instantly. The jaws closed on her upper torso and shoulder area before she could pull back or straighten. The bite of a large Nile crocodile is not a single point of pressure. The teeth drove through muscle and into bone across the full width of the jaw. The animal immediately began rotating its body violently to destabilize her and break tissue loose. The rolling motion tore through her shoulder and chest. She went over the railing and into the water. Once in the water, the animal submerged, taking her down with it. Staff responded immediately, using control poles and auditory deterrents to drive the animal back, while emergency services were called. The enclosure was secured, and the surrounding area was cleared. Marilyn Hodge was recovered from the enclosure by paramedics and pronounced dead at the scene. She was 63 years old. Investigators discovered repeated rule violations, led victim into enclosure, triggering conditioned crocodile attack response. Her daughter and son-in-law were present when it happened. She was buried in a private ceremony. It was May 21st, 2016, and by 11 p.m., the São Paulo skyline burned cold through floor-to-ceiling glass, while inside penthouse 34 of a newly completed building in the Jardins district, 30 people raised their glasses without knowing that one of them had already run out of time. Ricardo Alves was 28, a junior architect at a boutique firm who had spent 4 years working 18-hour days to reach the point where he could afford a place like this. He had purchased the penthouse 6 months before the housewarming, renovating every surface himself, including the centerpiece, a floor-to-ceiling glass terrarium built into the living room wall, housing a specimen of the Brazilian jararaca. Brazilian jararaca is one of South America's most medically significant pit vipers. Adults averaging 3 to 4 feet, carrying hemotoxic venom that attacks blood vessels and destroys tissue at the cellular level. Their heat-sensing pits track warm-blooded prey in total darkness. A single envenomation causes immediate sharp pain and swelling that spreads gradually over several hours, while systemic effects such as coagulopathy, hypotension, and kidney stress can develop progressively. Prompt antivenom is critical to prevent severe complications and even death. According to friends, the snake had come through a private dealer. Ricardo had apparently applied for a private keeper's license that kept being declined, something he dismissed when friends asked. I think that if your license application doesn't go through, that should have been a sign. The terrarium was impeccable, humidity controlled, UV lit, latched on all 4 panels. He treated it the same way he treated the exposed concrete ceiling and the reclaimed wood kitchen island. A design element, a controlled thing. The feeding slot latch had a known small clearance that required careful handling, and a heavy touch could move it. A guest named Tiago, visibly drunk by 10:40 p.m., had been photographing the terrarium on his phone for most of the evening. At some point, he leaned against the glass and his elbow nudged the feeding slot. A poorly latched panel moved roughly 6 inches, exposing the inside. The snake moved immediately. Ricardo's girlfriend, Elena Marquez, saw it first. She crossed the room, grabbed his arm, and told him the door had shifted and the snake was at the opening. Ricardo pushed the slot toward closed, and in that moment, the jararaca struck his left calf. He pulled his leg back. He applied a loose wrap around the bite site while keeping his leg still. Now, I'm no expert, but even I know that's just a partial first aid understanding, because he apparently did not attempt. Constrictive pressure. Elena told him twice in the first 15 minutes to call emergency services, and for some unknown reason, both times he refused. His friends were speculating that either he didn't want to get in trouble with the authorities, or he just didn't want to ruin the fun. Still, the bite site had begun swelling noticeably. By 11:15 p.m., the swelling had moved above the knee. The skin showed early ecchymosis and slight blistering along the inner calf. Ricardo set down his glass when walking became difficult. Several guests had gone quiet. Someone near the kitchen noticed a faint discoloration under his sock, early bruising. He grabbed the railing near the stairs and held on. His breathing had slowed to something deliberate and labored. By 11:45 p.m., he had collapsed twice. The second time, 2 guests held him upright by the arms while he clutched his leg with both hands. A guest who identified herself as a nursing student checked his pulse manually and found it weak and irregular. The skin below his knee was firm and discolored. She told the people around her to get him on the floor and keep him still. Elena called emergency services at 11:22 p.m., approximately 42 minutes after the bite. Ricardo could no longer stand unassisted. He was on the floor near the kitchen island, his back against the cabinetry, when systemic symptoms began to show: pallor, sweating, and shallow breathing as venom effects progressed. By 12:30 a.m., he was semi-conscious with worsening tissue damage and signs of internal bleeding. When paramedics arrived, Ricardo was barely conscious and his blood pressure critically low. Antivenom had still not been administered at the scene due to his deteriorating condition and delayed recognition of severity. He succumbed later at the hospital from complications including severe tissue necrosis and internal bleeding. The cause of death was complications of hemotoxic envenomation, including severe tissue damage and internal bleeding, compounded by coagulopathy and subsequent circulatory collapse. Environmental authorities seized the jararaca within hours and transferred it to a herpetological research facility outside the city. 14 of the 30 guests gave formal statements to civil police. 3 sought follow-up mental health support in the weeks that followed. Ricardo's firm issued a brief statement and declined further comment. "I really think this was a completely preventable tragedy," caused by Ricardo's stubbornness and overconfidence, ignoring warnings and treating a deadly snake like a decorative object. Even his refusal to call for help immediately turned a manageable bite into a fatal outcome. It was April 12, 2018, at a private animal facility in Crossville, Tennessee. Early evening, the light dropping, the property quiet except for the sounds of the animals. The facility sat on approximately 4 acres off a rural road and housed a number of large and exotic animals, including 2 Bengal tigers, a black bear, and several exotic birds. It was not a zoo. It was privately operated and open to visitors on a limited basis. Dylan Mercer, 31, had been keeping exotic animals for years before he started filming. He had developed his understanding of the animals through ownership and daily contact, not through formal training or professional certification. He knew the animals on his property the way someone who has lived with them for years knows them, through habit, pattern, and personal experience. That familiarity was real. It was also the basis of his confidence. And confidence built through familiarity without formal training has a particular kind of blind spot. And look, I want to be fair about this. Living with an animal for years is not nothing. That experience is real. The problem is that it can make you feel like you understand something that has never fully shown you what it is capable of. He started posting content about exotic animal care and handling. His early videos were advice-based: how to approach certain animals, how to read their behavior, what ownership actually looked like day to day. The tone was straightforward and the knowledge felt firsthand. His following grew slowly. Then one video performed far beyond anything he had posted before. The comments and shares came quickly. He watched the numbers and understood what that meant. And this is the part that gets me, because I have covered cases like this before, and this moment, the moment one video blows up and resets your understanding of what your audience wants, is the moment everything changes. After that, the content shifted. Less advice, more demonstration, less explaining, more showing. He began documenting his direct interactions with the animals on the property, particularly the tigers. The closer the interaction, the stronger the response. Viewers kept coming back to see what he would do next. The channel had approximately 4,800 followers by April 2018. The facility operated under an exhibitor license. Recent inspections had noted minor citations related to facility compliance. One of the tigers, a 4-year-old male named Raja, appeared in his content regularly. Dylan referred to the animal in videos and on stream as his boy. He described Raja as manageable, as an animal that knew him, as something different from what people imagined when they thought of a tiger. Raja weighed approximately 420 to 480 pounds. What gets me about that description, his boy, is that Dylan genuinely meant it. He believed it, and that belief is exactly what made the enclosure feel like somewhere he could walk into. On a previous stream, Dylan had mentioned that Raja had not been fed that day as part of the facility's feeding schedule, noting a minor supply delay. At approximately 7:14 p.m. on April 12th, Dylan began a live broadcast from the facility. He moved around the property while the audience grew. By 7:31 p.m., the viewer count had increased steadily. He told the audience he was going to go in with Raja. He had done this on camera before. The audience had seen it. Some of them were there specifically because they expected it. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Because Raja had not been fed. Dylan knew that. He entered the enclosure through the service gate, still holding his phone. Bengal tigers are large ambush predators. In the wild, they close distance on prey quickly and without warning, using explosive acceleration over short distances. The forelimb strike is the primary disabling mechanism. A single blow from a fully grown Bengal tiger is capable of breaking bone and immediately destabilizing an animal larger than a human. The bite that follows is positional and sustained. Dylan stepped inside. Raja hadn't been fed for roughly a day due to a supply delay, something Dylan knew. It wasn't long enough to make the animal desperate, but it was enough to put him out of routine. And it was already the time of evening Raja associated with feeding. Instead of waiting for that to be resolved, Dylan went in anyway, choosing to film while the animal was already keyed into that expectation. He entered the enclosure while waiting for the feed to arrive, the first. Contact was a forelimb strike, directed at the upper body. Dylan went down, the bite followed. Raja held the grip, repositioning once, in a way that wildlife professionals described as consistent with control behavior seen when large felids subdue prey. And this is the moment I find hardest to process. The audience watched it happen in real time. Several of them contacted emergency services during the stream. They were the ones who made the call. They reached the enclosure in minutes. First responders had already secured the area and isolated the animal before entry was possible. Dylan was located inside the enclosure, unresponsive. Paramedics initiated assessment immediately, but there were no signs of viable cardiac or respiratory function on arrival. Given the extent of traumatic injuries, resuscitation efforts were not initiated. He was pronounced dead at the scene at approximately 7:52 p.m. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be catastrophic traumatic injuries, consistent with a large felid attack, including blunt force impact and penetrating bite trauma. The facility was closed pending investigation. State authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed that the animal's behavior was consistent with a feeding response. Raja was euthanized the following day in accordance with safety protocol for large carnivore attacks. The exhibitor license was suspended during the review. Dylan's online accounts were taken offline shortly after. His family held a private service. One fact I can't deny is the animal did exactly what a hungry 400-pound tiger does when a person walks into its space at feeding time, and it paid for that with its life too. It was July 14, 2015, in a remote section of Flathead National Forest, Montana. Late afternoon, around 5:30 p.m., dense lodgepole pine. Low visibility, roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light wind pushing east. The trail wasn't maintained. No markers, nothing on any official map. Just a worn line through the trees that ends wherever the forest decides it does. Chet Mulvey was 34, a construction foreman out of Missoula. He was out for the weekend with two friends. No real itinerary, camping since the day before. Early afternoon, he had been drinking steadily for several hours. His friends estimated 6 to 8 beers over a 4-hour window. I want to be careful not to make this entirely about that, because people make bad decisions in the backcountry sober all the time. But it matters here, because what comes next required a level of judgment Chet simply didn't have access to at that point. He had no bear spray. Neither did his friends. At the Forest Road entry, a handwritten notice warned of recent grizzly activity in the drainage they were walking into. All three of them saw it. They kept walking. About 100 feet before the clearing, one of his friends mentioned a smell, strong, rotten, the kind that sits in the back of your throat. I've read enough of these to know exactly what that smell means, and I think most people do too, even if they've never encountered it before. It's not subtle. Ahead in the tree line, flies were clustered above one specific point and 2 ravens were working the canopy directly above it. Chet's friends noted both. Chet dismissed them and kept walking, pulling ahead of the group. That smell, those birds, that specific combination in grizzly country that is not an ambiguous signal. It points to one thing: a large ungulate carcass in an advanced state of decomposition, the signature of a grizzly food cache. A grizzly will kill or scavenge, partially consume, cover the remains with dirt and debris, and stay in the immediate area for days returning to feed. The cache is a defended resource. Chet was walking directly toward it, with nothing on him that would have made any difference. What strikes me about this part of the story is that Chet wasn't alone. He had 2 friends with him, 2 people who smelled the same thing, saw the same birds, and were standing on the same unmarked trail in the same grizzly drainage. And yet nobody stopped him. Nobody grabbed his arm or said, "Wait, I'm not placing the blame on them." I don't think I would have known how to stop someone who had already made up their mind either. But the fact that 3 people walked toward that smell together and only one of them kept going tells you something about where Chet's head was at that point in the afternoon. It also tells you something about how alcohol changes the way a person processes their environment. Not dramatically, not in a way that's obvious from the outside. Chet wasn't stumbling or incoherent. He was functional enough to walk a trail and hold a conversation, but the part of the brain that weighs risk, that takes a smell and a cluster of ravens and a warning sign and connects them into a single coherent picture, that part operates on a much thinner margin when it's impaired. 6 to 8 beers over 4 hours doesn't make a person reckless in an obvious way. It makes them just slightly less likely to stop. And in grizzly country, on an unmarked trail with a food cache, somewhere ahead in the tree line, slightly less likely to stop is all it takes. The grizzly bear is one of the few animals in North America that will engage without hesitation when a food cache is involved. Adult males in the northern Rockies weigh between 400 and 790 pounds and can reach 35 miles per hour over short distances, fast enough to close ground before most people have finished processing what they're seeing. The behavior around a cache is not predatory. The bear is not hunting. It is defending something it has already claimed, and the threshold for that response is extremely low, often without bluffing or warning, no posturing. The moment something enters that space, the bear moves. That distinction matters for understanding why it happened. It does not change what happened. Chet stepped into a small clearing about 85 feet ahead of his friends. The carcass was there, a partially consumed elk covered in dirt and pine debris. Roughly 20 feet to his left, the grizzly, a large adult male, was just beyond it, partially obscured by a downed log. The wind was moving east, carrying Chet's scent directly toward the bear. It had almost certainly been aware of him before he cleared the tree line. He stopped. His friends estimated 3 to 4 seconds, long enough to see the bear, long enough for the bear to have a full read on him, and then he raised his arm and waved it toward the animal. His friends described it as dismissive, like waving off a stray dog. I have gone back to that detail more times than I can count. A grizzly on a food cache, and Chet waved at it. The bear charged within 2 seconds. The distance closed in under 3. First contact was a strike across his upper left shoulder and neck, the kind of impact that drops a person from force alone, not pain. The bear followed immediately with a bite to the back of the skull and upper cervical spine. That second contact was the fatal injury. Investigators described the pattern as consistent with a defensive kill response. Bear was not feeding. It was neutralizing a threat to its cache. His 2 friends heard the impact and a single shout. They did not enter the clearing. They retreated to the trailhead, flagged down a passing truck, and drove 9 miles to a seasonal outpost on the forest boundary. No cell service, limited staff, not a full response station. From the time of the attack to the time a wildlife team reached the clearing, 2 hours and 40 minutes. I think about that number sometimes. 2 hours and 40 minutes is a long time to sit with what they had just witnessed and not be able to do a single thing about it. Chet was found roughly 10 feet from the point of first contact. The bear had not fed. Cause of death was the bite to the posterior skull and upper cervical spine. The strike had dropped him. The bite had killed him. The elk carcass was confirmed as an active food cache. The case was ruled a death by wildlife encounter. No investigation was opened. No action taken against the bear. The behavior was consistent with normal cache defense. It was April 22, 2018. The dry season had settled firmly across the Luangwa Valley, and the afternoon carried the particular stillness that comes when the heat begins to release its grip, but the air has not yet cooled. The sky above the river was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that appears in the hours before dusk, when the sun has dropped low enough to lose its intensity, but not yet close enough to the horizon to produce color. The tall grasses along the riverbank had gone dry and yellow, and the reeds that lined the slower bends of the Luangwa stood dense and unmoving in the absence of wind. The river itself ran slow. The dry season had reduced its volume considerably, concentrating the water into a narrower channel and pushing the current to a near drift in the bends where the gradient flattened. Daniel Navarro was 41 years old, a structural engineer based in Madrid. He had been working in his field for over 15 years, the kind of methodical, detail-oriented professional whose approach to planning extended into his personal life. The trip to Zambia had been organized months in advance, built around a broader Southern African itinerary that included stops across multiple countries. It was the kind of trip that families plan carefully, with specific activities booked at specific lodges, each chosen for what it offered. The river excursion had been selected as a late afternoon activity, marketed by the lodge as a quiet, low-impact approach to wildlife observation. The selling point was proximity. A small rubber raft, low to the water, moving slowly with the current, offered a perspective that larger motorized boats could not. Animals that would retreat from engine noise would remain undisturbed. The experience was positioned as intimate and unhurried. Maria Navarro was 39. She had worked as a secondary school teacher in Madrid for over a decade and had been the primary organizer of the family's travel itineraries over the years. Sophia was 15 and Lucas was 13. Both children had grown up hearing about Africa from their parents, who had traveled to the continent once before, years earlier, before the children were born. This trip was, in part, a fulfillment of something the family had discussed for years. Peter Mwansa was 34 years old and had been working as a river guide in the South Luangwa region for several years. He was licensed under the relevant wildlife authority and had accumulated a working knowledge of the Luangwa River's behavioral patterns, its animal populations, and the particular risks that came with navigating its slower bends in a low-profile watercraft. He had run this route many times. He knew where the pods tended to gather, which bends required caution, and how the light affected visibility in the late afternoon. The raft departed from the lodge's river access point in the mid-afternoon. The early portion of the excursion passed without incident. The river was quiet. Birds moved along the banks. The group drifted through open stretches where the channel was wide and the water clear enough to see the bottom in the shallows. Peter maintained a low voice and kept the raft moving at a pace that matched the current, using the paddle only to steer rather than to propel. By 5:40 p.m., the light had begun to change. The sun was low enough now that the shadows along the eastern bank had lengthened, and the river surface had lost its midday brightness. The channel had narrowed around a slow bend, flanked on both sides by tall reeds that rose well above the height of the raft's occupants. The visible water ahead compressed into a short corridor, perhaps 20 meters of clear surface before the bend obscured the rest. The current slowed further as the channel tightened. The raft's maneuverability at low drift speeds was limited. A rubber raft of this type responds to paddle input gradually, and in a narrow channel with minimal current. Course corrections take time. Peter identified movement ahead at approximately 5:44 p.m. He did not see the animals clearly. What he saw were ears and nostrils, barely breaking the surface, positioned along the inner curve of the bend. I don't think that's good news. The surface disturbance was subtle, the kind that an untrained observer would not register as significant. He recognized it immediately. A pod of hippos, partially submerged, occupying the channel directly ahead. He lowered his voice to near silence and began working the paddle to steer the raft away from the pod's position. The current offered little assistance. The raft moved slowly. At approximately 5:47 p.m., one of the submerged animals surged upward from directly beneath the raft. There was no extended warning display, no prolonged surface behavior that might have indicated the animal's position or intent. The hippo forced upward into the underside of the rubber hull with sudden, overwhelming force. The full weight of an animal that, in the case of an adult bull, can exceed 3,000 pounds driving the hull up and over in a single motion. The impact flipped the raft almost instantly. The motion was not a gradual tipping, but a sudden, violent inversion that gave none of the occupants time to brace or react. I personally find it so scary even just thinking about rafting in a river with hippos. But anyway, all 5 entered the water simultaneously. Common hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large animals on the African continent. Their territorial aggression in and around water is well documented across decades of field research and incident records. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and are capable of moving through water at speeds that belie their mass. Their canine teeth can exceed a foot in length. In territorial encounters, they do not behave as predators seeking to feed. A submerged pod near a river bend, in a narrow channel with limited visibility, represents one of the most dangerous configurations a small watercraft can encounter. The animals cannot be tracked beneath the surface. Their position is unknown until the moment of contact. The hippo did not hold a single position after the initial strike. It submerged, resurfaced, and struck again in short intervals. Each resurfacing displaced large volumes of water, further destabilizing anyone trying to stay afloat or orient themselves. Witnesses observing from a distant bank later described violent and repeated splashing and a deep, recurring bellow, consistent with territorial aggression rather than a single defensive charge. The animal was not targeting a specific individual. It was responding to movement at the surface, and there was movement everywhere. Daniel moved toward Sophia in the water, attempting to reach the overturned raft. The hippo resurfaced between them before he could close the distance. Maria and Lucas moved toward the bank, approximately 10 meters away. The water around them erupted repeatedly as the animal continued to surface and strike in short bursts. The bank was close. 10 meters in open water, under normal circumstances, is a short distance. In the chaos of a hippo-territorial encounter, with the water churning around them and the animal surfacing without pattern or warning, it was not reachable. Neither Maria nor Lucas made it to shore. Peter had managed to reach the overturned hull and pulled himself partially onto it. From that position, he attempted to call out directions, trying to keep the group oriented and moving toward the raft or the bank. The repeated resurfacing of the animal made any coordinated response impossible. Each time the water settled enough to assess the situation, it erupted again. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes from the moment of capsize to the moment the river went still. I assume 2 minutes in that situation felt like an eternity. When the water settled, there were no survivors visible at the surface. Recovery teams operating in the area later that evening and into the following morning began searching the river and nearby shoreline. The Luangwa's current, slow as it was, had already begun to move things. Over the course of the following days, the bodies of all 4 family members and the guide were recovered, some from the water, some from the bank downstream. The recovery operation was not swift, and it was not clean. The subsequent investigation identified several compounding factors that had contributed to the outcome. The rubber raft's low profile placed all occupants at water level, offering no elevation above the surface and no structural protection against impact from below. The narrowing of the channel around the bend, combined with the height of the surrounding reeds, had reduced forward visibility to a distance that did not allow sufficient time for course correction once the pod was identified. The slow current had further limited the guide's ability to steer clear after the pod's position became apparent. The fact that the animal remained fully submerged before the strike meant there was no surface behavior available to read before contact. The late afternoon timing placed the excursion in the period when hippoterritorial behavior is typically at its most active, as animals that have been resting in the water through the heat of the day begin to move toward their grazing routes, particularly in confined sections of river, where movement between resting zones and grazing routes becomes concentrated. No negligence was formally attributed to the operator. The investigation concluded that the guide had responded appropriately, given the constraints of the situation and the speed with which events developed. The incident prompted a formal review of rubber raft excursion protocols across several operators in the South Luangwa region, with particular attention to channel navigation near known hippo territories during the late afternoon hours and the adequacy of pre-departure briefings regarding submerged animal behavior. And I can't help but think, a review that came 5 lives too late. It was August 9th, 2015, and the dry season quiet of Kruger National Park's lower rest camp sat between the acacia trees like something waiting, kind of mourning, that should have kept everyone close to shade and off the perimeter paths. Conan Dlamini was 22, a second-year business administration student. He had grown up in Polokwane, the oldest of 3 siblings, and had visited Kruger once before on a school trip. What occupied him now was content. He had built a following of around 2,000 people online by filming himself reacting to things. This weekend trip with 4 university friends was a post-exam release, and Conan had brought his selfie stick with that implicit purpose in mind. Contrary to this incident, he was apparently not known as someone who took things too far. I read that his friends described him as someone who could read a situation. I guess he simply misjudged this one. The group had wandered toward the camp's quieter eastern perimeter when one of his friends spotted the snake under a marula tree and pointed. The ground along that stretch was dry and root-crossed, shadowed by mopane and marula, exact habitat for the black mamba. Adults reach between 7 and 9 feet and are among the most efficient, venomous snakes on the continent. Their venom is almost purely neurotoxic, progressively disabling nerve-to-muscle communication from the strike site inward until the respiratory muscles can no longer contract. Without antivenom, death from respiratory failure can occur in 20 to 60 minutes in severe cases, especially with neck or head bites, depending on venom load. A rope line between wooden posts marked the restricted boundary, with a bilingual warning sign fixed to the nearest tree. The group crossed it without discussion. Saifo Nkosi, one of Conan's friends, told a local reporter later that they had not read the sign carefully and assumed it was protecting vegetation. The snake was already in a raised posture, head lifted from its coil, when they came within range. That posture, in a mamba, means the animal has already registered a threat. Conan extended his selfie stick toward it, likely to get the angle he wanted. His friends were still laughing when the snake moved. The first strike hit his right forearm. The footage recovered from his phone shows only a frame blur, and then the snake already withdrawn. Conan shook his arm out and looked at the punctures, small and paired. He was still smiling when the second strike landed on the left side of his neck within 4 seconds of the first. Immediately recognizing something was wrong, Conan walked toward the nearby path, and his friends helped him. They began shouting for help and moving quickly toward the ranger station. He vomited once while walking, and his sweating became noticeable on his shirt. By the time they reached a point visible from the main camp road, his limbs were noticeably weak, his steps uneven, and he required support from 2 friends to continue. They flagged down a passing vehicle carrying maintenance staff, who radioed for a ranger pickup, but the camp's internal radio system was temporarily down, causing a brief delay. On the way, Venom progressed rapidly. His speech slurred, grip weakened, and his legs gave way multiple times, forcing the friends to lift him into the vehicle. Froth formed at the corners of his mouth. Breathing became shallow and effortful, but he remained conscious enough to track movement with his eyes. The rangers who eventually met them at the edge of the camp tried to administer oxygen, but it was already too late to reverse the neurotoxic progression. Conan lost the ability to breathe independently while being transferred in the ranger vehicle. He showed no distress on his face in the final minutes. That was the detail Saifo returned to in his interview. There was was no expression that told them it was ending. Coroner findings showed 2 envenomation sites confirmed, right forearm and left lateral neck. The neck strike allowed rapid venom access near major vessels, accelerating systemic spread. Cause of death was respiratory paralysis, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation consistent with black mamba. Time of death estimated within 40 to 50 minutes of first strike, consistent with severe systemic progression of mamba venom. No antivenom was administered before death. The 3 friends who stayed with Conan were treated at the camp medical station for shock. Sifo gave a brief account to a local Limpopo newspaper the following week. What made this story sad for me is that he said the part that stayed with him was how ordinary it looked from the outside, that they were trying to help someone they knew, and then they weren't. The Black Mamba was located that evening and captured and safely relocated by trained park wildlife staff deeper into the reserve, following standard Kruger snake handling protocol. It was July 12, 2018, on the remote banks of the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where early morning mist hovered over narrow channels and papyrus reeds swayed gently in the breeze. Tourists often describe this area as serene, but beneath the calm surface lurked one of Africa's most efficient aquatic predators. Samuel Dorrance, 33, a British wildlife filmmaker and aspiring YouTuber, had traveled alone from London to capture footage of a rare Sitatunga antelope herd. Experienced with cameras and drones, he had no formal survival training in crocodile habitats. Samuel had booked a private Mokoro tour, the traditional dugout canoe excursions that glide silently along the channels, with local guide Temba Kama, 41. Temba knew the delta and its dangers, giving daily briefings about staying low, keeping hands inside, and never leaning toward the water. Even I've caught myself leaning over the bow for a better angle, and Samuel's habit of kneeling or leaning out to get a wider shot shows exactly how tempting those perfect shots can be. That morning, the water was calm, and the reeds provided the perfect backdrop for low-angle shots. Samuel insisted on filming a slow-motion clip of himself, pointing the camera directly into the sunrise while kneeling at the edge of the Mokoro. Temba cautioned him again, reminding him that Nile crocodiles were opportunistic and could strike from as little as 2 meters away, often unseen until it was too late. Samuel laughed it off, saying he knew what he was doing and would stay ready to react. I can relate to that overconfidence, thinking you're ready for anything. Even though he had been briefed repeatedly, Samuel's focus on getting the perfect shot made him underestimate just how quickly a crocodile could react. From my own experiences near rivers, it's easy to assume that staying alert is enough, but in reality, these predators can detect the slightest movement long before you notice them. That brief sense of control can vanish in an instant. The attack happened in seconds. A large male Nile crocodile, estimated at 4 meters and over 450 kilograms, had been lying motionless near a bend in the channel, eyes barely visible. Above the water, Samuel's forward-leaning movement triggered the crocodile's predatory response. With explosive speed, it lunged, seizing him by the lower torso and pulling him partially into the water. The Mokoro rocked violently. Temba shouted, dropped the paddle, and tried to fend the crocodile off with the blunt end. The predator executed a partial death roll, the torque tearing clothing and flesh instantly. Samuel's scream was swallowed by the channel, and the camera toppled into the water, recording only blurry, chaotic footage of the attack. Within moments, Samuel was submerged. Temba reached the nearest riverbank to call for emergency support from the Botswana Predator Conservation Authority. Rescue divers arrived nearly 90 minutes later, but the fast-flowing channels and underwater vegetation had concealed Samuel's body. Post-mortem reports confirmed massive soft tissue loss, multiple fractures, and severe spinal cord trauma as the primary cause of death. The injuries included tearing of muscle and connective tissue from the lower torso, compression fractures along the vertebrae, and extensive damage to internal organs, consistent with the bite force and rotational torque exerted by a Nile crocodile. Medical examiners noted that survival would have been impossible due to rapid blood loss and structural damage sustained in the attack. His remains were found partially upstream, wedged under a submerged tree root system. Post-mortem reports confirmed massive soft tissue loss, multiple fractures, and spinal cord injury as the cause of death. Even I've leaned too far in a canoe for the perfect shot, and Samuel's story is a stark reminder of how quickly a small lapse can turn deadly. Staying seated with hands inside is critical. Minor movements outside recommended positions account for most fatal crocodile attacks. Once the posture is breached, predators act instantly. Samuel's overconfidence turned a controlled experience into a fatal encounter showing that in predator territory, caution isn't optional, it's survival. The incident prompted local authorities to increase safety advisories for private Mokoro tours, emphasizing low positions in the canoe and strict avoidance of leaning or kneeling near the edge. Samuel's body was repatriated to London, and his family later released a statement urging aspiring wildlife filmmakers to prioritize safety over cinematic ambition.
It was August 23, 2015, when the oppressive Florida heat hung thick over the vast wetlands of Everglades National Park. The summer sun blazed overhead, creating a shimmering haze across the endless expanse of sawgrass marshes and cypress swamps. 21-year-old Jenna Hollister had driven down from Tallahassee with 5 sorority sisters, their SUV packed with coolers, cameras, and dreams of creating ultimate spring break content. Jenna was a junior at Florida State University, studying marketing while working part-time at a campus retail store. Her competitive nature and willingness to push boundaries for the perfect shot had attracted online attention. Her Instagram account had grown steadily, and she was determined to break into influencer territory. The Everglades trip was their group's grand finale before returning to classes. The group had arrived during peak mating season for American alligators, though none had researched the significance of timing. Park rangers had briefed visitors about maintaining safe distances from wildlife, especially during breeding periods when territorial behavior intensified. Jenna listened with casual attention, more interested in scouting locations than absorbing crucial information about alligator behavior. Her friends had noticed Jenna's pattern of taking increasingly risky photos throughout their Florida trip. She had waded closer to manatees than recommended and consistently dismissed safety concerns. Each post garnered more engagement, fueling her confidence that bigger risks would yield bigger rewards. The American alligator represents one of nature's most successful predators, virtually unchanged for over 200 million years. Adult males can reach lengths of 14 feet and weigh over 1,000 pounds, with incredibly powerful jaws capable of exerting bite forces exceeding 2,980 pounds per square inch. During mating season, male alligators become extremely territorial and aggressive, defending their chosen areas with lethal force. Alligators are ambush predators, perfectly adapted for shallow wetlands. Their eyes, ears, and nostrils are positioned on top of their heads, allowing them to remain nearly submerged while monitoring their surroundings. They can remain motionless for hours, appearing like floating logs until explosive bursts of speed propel them toward prey at speeds reaching 35 miles per hour in water. On the afternoon of August 23rd, the group discovered a secluded area where several large alligators basked along the water's edge. The largest specimen, a massive 12-foot male, lay partially submerged in shallow water near the bank. To the untrained eye, the reptile appeared docile as it remained perfectly still. Jenna immediately recognized the photo opportunity. While her friends set up their picnic on higher ground, Jenna grabbed her phone and began wading into knee-deep water. The murky brown liquid was warm against her legs as she moved slowly toward the resting alligator. She positioned herself approximately 6 feet from the massive reptile's head, close enough to capture both herself and the predator in a single frame. The alligator had been aware of human presence from the moment the group arrived. When Jenna entered the water and began moving closer, the reptile's predatory instincts activated. As Jenna raised her phone to capture the selfie, she created the perfect storm of triggers. The splashing water sent vibrations that the alligator's sensitive system interpreted as prey activity. The attack came with terrifying speed. The 800-pound alligator exploded from its resting position, its powerful tail propelling its massive body forward. Jenna had no time to react before the reptile's jaws clamped down on her left thigh with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked her off balance, sending her tumbling into deeper water. The alligator's conical teeth penetrated deep into muscle and bone. The initial bite severed her femoral artery, causing immediate and catastrophic blood loss that turned the brown water crimson. True to its species hunting behavior, the alligator immediately initiated its signature death roll. The massive reptile began spinning rapidly in the water, using its entire body weight to disorient and drown its victim. Jenna was pulled underwater and spun violently, her body rotating with the alligator's powerful movements. During the death roll, her femur snapped completely under the tremendous rotational forces. The combination of massive blood loss from the severed femoral artery and inability to breathe during prolonged submersion proved fatal. Jenna's body went into shock from trauma and blood loss, while her lungs filled with murky swamp water. After 2 minutes of continuous death rolling, her movements ceased entirely. The alligator released its grip and allowed the body to float to the surface, typical behavior as they often cache prey underwater for later consumption. Park rangers arrived within 20 minutes, but recovery efforts were complicated by multiple large alligators in the area. Jenna's body was retrieved 4 hours later. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission launched an investigation, reviewing safety protocols. Jenna's family released a brief statement expressing grief and requesting privacy. The incident reignited debates about social media culture and the dangerous lengths young people will go to for viral content.
The morning of April 14th, 2014 dawned with perfect conditions at southeast Farallon Island, California. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a brilliant blue sky, with crystal-clear visibility that marine researchers dream of. The water temperature held steady at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, ideal for the California sea lions that called these rocky outcroppings home. Emma Rodriguez, 24, couldn't have asked for better conditions for her thesis research dive. The UC Santa Barbara graduate student had been awake since 4:30 a.m., her excitement barely contained as she prepared her equipment on the research vessel. Emma was intensely passionate about marine biology, methodical in her research, and fearless when it came to underwater exploration. She had completed her scientific diving certification 18 months earlier and had already logged 89 research dives, mostly in the familiar waters of Monterey Bay. Working under Dr. Patricia Chen's lab, Emma was conducting her third dive at the Farallons, focusing on California sea lion foraging behavior for her master's thesis. The Farallon Islands, located 27 miles west of San Francisco, were known as the Galapagos of California for their incredible biodiversity. What made these waters so rich in marine life also made them incredibly dangerous. The Farallons sit directly in the path of the California Current, creating an explosion of marine life that attracts the ocean's most feared predator. Massive colonies of seals and sea lions, over 100,000 individuals during peak season, hauled out on the rocky shores. Great white sharks patrol these waters with evolutionary perfection honed over 400 million years. These apex predators can grow up to 20 feet in length and weigh over 5,000 pounds. Their torpedo-shaped bodies capable of explosive bursts of speed reaching 25 miles per hour. Their most terrifying feature is their mouth, lined with up to 300 serrated triangular teeth that continuously regenerate throughout their lifetime. At 6:45 a.m., Emma made her fatal mistake. She descended to 25 feet, positioning herself directly above a seal haul-out ledge during peak predation hours, the ring of death that occurs between 6 and 8 a.m. when seals return from overnight foraging trips, exhausted and vulnerable. Wearing her standard black wetsuit and carrying a bright yellow data slate, Emma remained perfectly still 15 feet above the seal colony, methodically counting and photographing the animals. What Emma didn't know was that an 18-foot female great white had been patrolling these waters since dawn. This massive predator, weighing approximately 4,500 pounds, had already made 2 unsuccessful attacks on seals and was in an aggressive hunting state. Female great whites are typically larger than males and more aggressive, especially during feeding periods. Great whites possess extraordinary sensory capabilities that make them perfect killing machines. They can detect a single drop of blood in 25 gallons of water from up to 3 miles away. Emma's silhouette against the surface, combined with her black wetsuit and methodical movements, perfectly mimicked a resting seal. Her yellow data slate, flashing in the sunlight, may have resembled the pale belly of an injured seal. The attack came with devastating precision. The shark approached from the deep channel below, accelerating to its maximum speed of 25 miles per hour in the last 20 feet. The attack was so violent that the shark's momentum carried both predator and prey several feet above the surface in an explosion of white water. The massive jaws, measuring 18 inches across, delivered the initial bite to Emma's torso with the full force of 1,800 psi. The serrated teeth, each up to 2.5 inches long, sliced through her wetsuit, flesh and bone with surgical precision. Her dive partner, working 150 feet away, heard the distinctive surface disturbance and saw the explosive white water that marked a great white attack. The research vessel crew activated emergency protocols immediately, but Emma had sustained catastrophic damage to major organs and arteries. The great white's bite had crushed ribs, punctured lungs, and severed major blood vessels. She was recovered in just 4 minutes, but the massive internal bleeding and shock had already begun shutting down her vital systems. Emma died before the Coast Guard helicopter could reach the mainland. Her promising career in marine science cut tragically short during peak predation hours in the world's most active great white hunting ground.
It was May 11th, 2016, in Hohenwald, Tennessee. The morning tour at the Managed Elephant Facility was moving through its scheduled stations, small groups following guides along marked pathways. The rules were posted at every stop and repeated at the entrance. It advised visitors to stay behind the barriers and avoid unsupervised contact. Deborah Kane, 58, was a retired travel agent who had spent 30 years booking wildlife tours for other people and had decided she knew more about animals than most guides half her age. Friends described her as opinionated and confident, someone who rarely accepted correction and almost never admitted she was wrong. She had a particular interest in elephants, referencing documentaries and travel programs throughout the morning as evidence of her familiarity with the animals. From the moment the tour began, she positioned herself not as a visitor following instructions, but as someone assessing whether the instructions were worth following. This is the part that gets me. She'd spent 30 years booking these tours. She knew the rules, just didn't think they applied to her. At the first stop, she tried to feed one of the elephants outside the scheduled feeding window. The guide corrected her. Deborah told him the animal was clearly expecting food and that withholding it was unnecessary. The guide moved on. At the second stop, she reached out to touch an elephant during a no-contact segment. The guide corrected her again. She told him the rule made no sense, given how calm the animal appeared. At the third stop, she crossed a rope boundary to get a closer photograph and had to be escorted back. She responded loudly, asking why the rules existed at all if the animals were accustomed to people. At some point during the tour, she told the guide, a 26-year-old handler with 3 years of hands-on experience, that her knowledge of elephant behavior from documentaries was extensive. The guide said nothing and kept the group moving. 26 years old with 3 years of hands-on experience. And she told him his documentary knowledge was not as good as hers. I genuinely had to put my notes down for a second when I read that. The final station was a controlled feeding area. Visitors stood behind a reinforced steel barrier fitted with a narrow feeding slot that limited how far a hand could extend. The elephant at this station was Rosie, a 47-year-old female who had been at the facility for 9 years. Staff described her as stable and accustomed to visitors, but highly food-motivated and sensitive to sudden contact near her face. Elephants have highly developed spatial memory and strong food-motivated behavior. An animal accustomed to a feeding routine will track and anticipate contact near its face and react sharply to anything that disrupts that expectation. The guide explained the rules before the group approached. Stay behind the barrier. Keep hands flat. Do not reach past the designated point. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Deborah joined the group at the barrier and followed the instructions for about 30 seconds. Then, she decided to take a photograph. The angle was not right from behind the slot. She stepped to the side of the designated feeding slot, where the barrier curvature created a slightly wider gap, and leaned past the intended limit, reaching out to touch Rosie's face to hold her still for the shot. Rosie pulled back sharply, her head swinging and her trunk moving in a rapid reactive motion. Deborah lost her balance forward, dropping at the base of the barrier with her upper body angled into the reach zone through the gap. Rosie reacted instantly, slamming her forefoot down onto Deborah's upper body and pinning her against the ground. with crushing force. The compression was immediate and severe, fracturing multiple ribs and causing catastrophic internal injury to her chest cavity. The guide reacted within seconds. The area was cleared, and emergency services were called. Deborah Kane was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 58 years old. Investigators discovered repeated violations led to unauthorized contact, triggering elephants' forceful reactive behavior, causing fatal injuries. The hardest part is that the guide documented everything, every correction, violation, and warning. It's all in the report, and none of it stopped what happened at the final station. It was March 3rd, 2018, in the Northern Territory, Australia. The estuary outside Darwin was low and quiet at dusk, the tidal water dark and still, the last of the light sitting flat across the surface. It was the kind of place that looked calm because nothing was moving. That is not the same thing as safe. Liam Carter, 22, ran a wildlife content page on social media with around 3,400 followers. He had built it around a single recurring format he called Too Close. The premise was straightforward: find a dangerous animal, get as close as possible, film the reaction. He had approached a brown snake at close range. He had waded through floodwater in Kakadu National Park during wet season. Neither had ended badly. The format was working. His follower count had grown steadily with each upload, and the comments on his most recent videos were pushing him towards something bigger. Several followers had been asking when he was going to film a crocodile. One comment that appeared multiple times across his last 3 posts read, "Do a croc next." And look, this pattern comes up every single time in content creators' cases. The audience does not know they are part of the story. They are just asking for the next video. He had driven up to the Northern Territory with a friend. The two had made the trip together, with the plan of filming new content over several days. His friend was there for most of it, helping carry equipment, watching from the bank, waiting while Liam got closer to things than most people would consider. He had been in the Northern Territory for 4 days when he identified the animal in the estuary. He posted about it that afternoon. The response was immediate. People wanted to see it. That unbroken record of walking away, combined with the pressure of an audience expecting the next escalation, was the most dangerous thing about him by the time he arrived at the water's edge. What gets me about that is how invisible that pressure is from the outside. His friend was standing on the bank watching. The audience was watching, and every single one of them had watched him walk away before. He had identified a large saltwater crocodile in the area through local reports and social media posts from other users in the region. The animal was estimated at around 13 feet. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest reptiles on Earth and among the most effective ambush predators alive. They do not chase or display before attacking. They wait. They can remain motionless for hours, fully submerged or barely visible at the waterline, and move when the calculation is right. They detect movement through pressure sensors along the jaw and through sensitivity to surface vibration, which means there is no safe angle of approach and no blind spot that reduces the risk of detection. The authorities had installed warning signs at multiple points along the estuary following prior fatalities in the area. Liam walked past them. He had watched online content suggesting that approaching a crocodile from a certain angle reduced the risk of detection. The same source had noted clearly that no angle made close proximity safe. Liam had taken the first part and left the second behind. He strapped his GoPro to his chest, set it recording, and waded into the water at dusk. His friend stayed on the bank. The water came to his knees. He moved slowly, keeping his profile low, angling toward the area where he believed the animal was resting. He kept moving forward. And this is the moment I find hardest to sit with. Because at knee depth, in that light, with that animal already in the water, the outcome was already decided. Liam just did not know it yet. The crocodile did not move for approximately 11 seconds after Liam entered its range. Stillness is not disengagement. It is the final phase before a strike. The animal was already tracking him before the lunge began. The crocodile came forward from the waterline in a single explosive movement, covering the distance between them before Liam had processed what was happening. The jaws closed on his lower body with a force that made resistance impossible. The bite of a large saltwater crocodile can exceed 3,000 pounds of force per square inch. Bone and tissue gave way instantly. Liam was pulled off his feet and dragged below the surface in the same motion. What followed was the death roll. The crocodile rotated its body violently, spinning through the water with Liam locked in its jaws. The GoPro captured 11 seconds of footage before the water covered the lens. On the bank, his friend was screaming into his phone. I have thought about that friend a lot since I first read this case. He drove up there with Liam. He had been on every shoot. He watched it happen from the bank, and there was nothing he could do. That is something a person carries for the rest of their life. Emergency services were notified immediately by his friend on the bank. Authorities secured the area, but entry into the water was delayed until the crocodile could be located and conditions assessed as safe. Initial recovery efforts that evening were unsuccessful due to visibility and tidal movement. Search operations continued over the following days across the estuary system. Liam Carter's remains were recovered in multiple locations consistent with tidal dispersal. A formal medical examination was conducted following recovery. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be fatal injuries and drowning resulting from a saltwater crocodile attack. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed the behavior as a standard ambush predation response. Warning signage in the area was documented. The location was temporarily restricted during recovery operations. His final footage was retained by investigators and not released. His channel was later removed to prevent others from doing something like that. It was March 12, 2017, and by 9 that evening, Fort Lauderdale emergency room physician would be on the phone with a toxicologist in Melbourne, trying to identify a venom for which no American hospital kept a stock of appropriate anti-venom because no one in this country was supposed to have the snake. Marcus Camus, 34, worked as an HVAC technician out of Fort Lauderdale and had spent the better part of a decade building a reptile collection that lived in the gap between legal and not. I'm always surprised how people keep getting away with harboring illegal animals in America despite strict laws. His converted garage held roughly 20 snakes, most permitted under Florida law, a few not. And in those few was a juvenile inland taipan, kept in a locked plastic tub inside a secondary lockable cabinet, labeled Cayman as a decoy. Marcus had no formal training, no institutional affiliation. What he had was an unbroken record of handling black mambas, gaboon vipers, and crates without incident, and he treated that record the way gamblers treat winning streaks. That evening, he had invited Lily Hagan, 29, a woman from Tinder, to his garage, a controlled shock designed to impress. She said that he tapped the lid of the taipan's tub with his knuckle to make it move. Now you wouldn't find me close to an inland taipan. It's the most venomously toxic land snake on Earth. A single bite delivers enough venom to kill over 100 adults. Its complex blend of neurotoxins, myotoxins, and procoagulants attacks the nervous system, muscle tissue, and blood's ability to clot simultaneously. The snake can strike and retract in under 0.15 seconds, far beyond the threshold of human reaction time. It normally avoids confrontation and would only bite defensively if threatened. When the lid shifted under his knuckle, the taipan struck through the gap before it had fully opened. The fangs connected with the inside of his right forearm, just below the wrist. The bite lasted under a second. Marcus pressed a shop rag against the 2 puncture marks, told Lily it was nothing. Now you wouldn't find me close to an inland taipan. It's the most venomously toxic land snake on Earth. A single bite delivers enough venom to be lethal, though fatalities are rare with prompt treatment. Now, here's what baffles me. Marcus said they were still going to dinner. Based on how proud he is of the specimen, he's likely aware that it's the most venomous snake in the world. I keep thinking to myself, why did he not seek help? Why brush it off, knowing you're risking dying? Lily watched the skin around the wound begin to redden slightly, and his color shift. Not dramatic, but enough. They drove to a chain restaurant on Federal Highway, Marcus at the wheel. By the time they sat at the table, 15 minutes after the bite, he was sweating through his shirt, and Lily said that his speech had a slight drag. He walked inside under his own power. Within 90 minutes, he began to feel generalized weakness in his arms and legs, a slight droop of the eyelids, and difficulty speaking clearly. A busboy later told investigators that Marcus appeared pale and was holding his arms stiffly, looking unwell. Over the next 10 minutes, his muscles began to tremble and his jaw stiffened. His body slowly lost coordination rather than locking violently. He sank down into the booth as his breathing became shallow and labored, with long pauses between breaths. His eyes were open, but unfocused, the whites showing at the lower rim. Lily was on her feet screaming. A server knelt beside the booth and gripped his shoulder to keep him from sliding to the floor. His arms gradually stopped moving, and his chest rose weakly with each breath. Restaurant staff called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Marcus had very weak vital signs, barely breathing and with a faint pulse. They worked him in the parking lot for 32 minutes before transport. He was pronounced dead at the hospital approximately 4 hours after the bite. Coroner's report listed the cause of death as acute envenomation, consistent with inland taipan. Wildlife officers found 23 snakes in total in his apartment, 11 of which were protected or prohibited under state and federal law. The taipan was alive and undisturbed in its locked tub inside the cabinet. It was transported to a licensed facility in Georgia. The garage was sealed pending federal review of the import chain. It was April 8, 2015, along the banks of the Zambezi River in Lower Zambezi National Park, Zambia, where a wide sandy bank sloped quietly into slow-moving brown water. Just meters from shore, beneath a still inlet partially covered in reeds and algae, something large remained hidden. Hank Barsaga, 52, a semi-retired tobacco farmer from Chinhoyi, Zimbabwe, led a solitary, physically demanding life. Over 6 feet tall and heavily built, he spent most days repairing engines or tending a small garden. Twice divorced and rarely in contact with his adult children, he carried a quiet confidence from years of hands-on work. The canoe safari, arranged by his brother Fanis to reconnect, appealed to Hank, who felt at ease in the river and believed he understood its risks. The early part of the safari went by without incident. The group paddled downstream, camping on riverbanks and islands, observing wildlife from a distance. Their guide, Chisulobanda, 41, repeated the same rules each morning. Stay away from the water's edge, never crouch near the bank, and avoid direct contact with the river. I saw these weren't just casual suggestions. They came from years of fatal incidents, where one wrong step had cost someone their life. Hank acknowledged the instructions, but showed little concern, noting that crocodiles were slow and almost indifferent. The lunch stop appeared safe at first glance. The bank was open, slightly elevated, and offered clear visibility. No tracks or disturbances suggested recent animal activity, yet a narrow inlet branched inward, the water darker and still, partially obscured by reeds and algae. Field studies consistently identify these quiet inlets as high-risk zones. Still water allows crocodiles to remain hidden at extremely close range. After eating, Hank approached the water. His hands were greasy from handling fish, and he ignored the suggestion to use a bottle. He moved to the edge, lowered himself onto one knee, and leaned forward, placing both hands into the river just below the surface. The crocodile had already detected him. Hidden less than 5 meters away, it remained submerged, eyes and nostrils barely above water. The movement of Hank's hands was enough to trigger the predator. I've seen situations like this in my research, and it's striking how quickly a hidden threat can react to the smallest movement. The strike came instantly. The surface erupted. The crocodile lunged forward. Hank reacted too late. His right hand escaped, but his left arm was caught as the jaws closed. The force crushed bone instantly and pulled him forward. He screamed, struggling, fingers clawing into the wet sand, but the crocodile shifted its grip higher, securing him across the chest and abdomen. His leverage disappeared. Within moments, he was pulled fully into the river. The attack lasted only seconds. The water churned violently as the crocodile spun, maintaining its hold. A single glimpse of Hank's arm appeared above the surface before disappearing. Then, the river returned to calm. It's terrifying to realize how quickly a calm moment can turn deadly. There's almost no time to react once the predator strikes. Fanis reached the bank, but was pulled back. The guide secured the group and called for emergency help, knowing that attempting to enter the water would only risk more lives. By the time a response team arrived over an hour later, the river yielded no sign of him. Hank's remains were recovered the next morning downstream, lodged beneath submerged roots, and confirmed through dental records and a tattoo. The incident was classified as a wildlife-related fatality. The crocodile was not pursued. The area was reassessed, and operators were instructed to avoid riverbanks near inlets or dense vegetation. This outcome highlights the razor-thin margin for safety in such environments. Even small actions, kneeling at the edge, placing hands in the water, ignoring a guide's instruction, can eliminate that margin entirely. From what I've seen, staying back from the water and following the guide's instructions is the only way to feel truly safe. Once a crocodile is underwater, there's almost no way to spot it before it strikes. Hank's body was returned to Zimbabwe. There was no widespread media coverage and no extended investigation beyond standard procedures. What remains is the stark reminder that ordinary, seemingly minor choices can align in seconds to create a fatal outcome.
It was November 18, 2018, when the dense forests of Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania echoed with the calls of chimpanzees. and the rustle of leaves in the canopy above. The park, established by Jane Goodall in the 1960s, stretched along the shores of Lake Tanganyika, providing perfect habitat for one of Africa's most studied chimpanzee populations. Erica Winslow, 23, had arrived 6 months earlier as part of her PhD research in primatology, eager to observe chimpanzee social structures for her dissertation at Cambridge University. Erica was a graduate research assistant whose academic brilliance had earned her a coveted position on the long-term research project. Her professors praised her dedication, but her field supervisors had grown concerned about her tendency to anthropomorphize the chimpanzee's behavior. She often spoke about the animals as if they were friendly neighbors rather than wild primates, expressing a desire to connect with them personally. The research station operated under strict protocols, developed over decades of study. Researchers were required to maintain a minimum distance of 15 feet from the chimpanzees at all times, never make direct eye contact, and avoid facial expressions that could be interpreted as threats. Erica had received extensive training on these protocols, but her field notes revealed a pattern of gradually pushing boundaries in her eagerness to capture intimate behavioral moments. Her research focused on territorial disputes between neighboring chimpanzee communities, particularly during feeding times when competition intensified aggressive behaviors. Erica had been documenting these interactions for months, but her supervisor had recently warned her about getting too close during tense situations. She dismissed these concerns, believing her months of observation had given her special insight into the animal's moods. Chimpanzees are humanity's closest living relatives, sharing over 98% of our DNA, but they possess physical capabilities that far exceed human strength. Adult males can weigh up to 150 pounds and are approximately 5 times stronger than humans of similar size. Their powerful arms can exert tremendous force, while their large canine teeth can inflict devastating wounds. Chimpanzees live in complex social hierarchies where dominance is established through displays of aggression and violence. During territorial conflicts, chimpanzees become extremely aggressive, viewing any unfamiliar presence as a potential threat to their group's resources. Their attacks are swift and brutal, targeting the face, hands, and genitals. Male chimpanzees are particularly dangerous during feeding competitions, when their territorial instincts are heightened. On the morning of November 18th, Erica followed a group of 8 chimpanzees to a fig tree heavy with ripe fruit. The location was disputed territory between 2 communities, and tension was evident in the animal's behavior. The alpha male, a large chimpanzee named Frodo, positioned himself prominently near the base of the tree, while other males spread out to guard the feeding site. As the morning progressed, a rival group approached from the east, creating a standoff between the 2 communities. The tension escalated rapidly, with both groups engaging in aggressive displays, screaming, and branch shaking. Erica, excited by the rare opportunity to observe intergroup conflict, moved closer to capture better footage. She positioned herself within 10 feet of the alpha male, violating safety protocols. When Frodo turned toward her, Erica made the fatal mistake of smiling and making direct eye contact. In chimpanzee communication, bared teeth represent an aggressive threat display, while direct eye contact is interpreted as a dominance challenge. Frodo's response was immediate and violent. The 120-pound male launched himself at Erica with explosive speed, his powerful arms propelling him across the distance in less than 2 seconds. His initial strike knocked Erica to the ground, his massive hands gripping her left arm with crushing force. The chimpanzee's grip strength of over 1,300 pounds per square inch immediately fractured the bones in her forearm. 2 other males joined the attack, interpreting Erica's presence as a territorial invasion during the critical feeding dispute. The chimpanzees focused their assault on Erica's face and arms, their primary targets during aggressive encounters. Frodo's powerful jaws clamped down on Erica's shoulder, his 4-inch canine teeth penetrating deep into the muscle and severing the brachial artery.
The attack continued for approximately 3 minutes, with the chimpanzees delivering multiple bites and strikes. Erica's scalp was partially torn away, Her fingers were severed by powerful bites, and deep lacerations covered her arms and torso. The most critical injury occurred when Frodo bit down on her neck, his canine teeth puncturing the carotid artery and causing massive blood loss.
Erica's body went into shock from the severe trauma and rapid blood loss. The severed brachial and carotid arteries caused her blood pressure to drop precipitously, while the multiple wounds created hypovolemic shock. She lost consciousness within 4 minutes of the initial attack and died from exsanguination before the research team could reach her location. The research station immediately contacted Tanzanian authorities and suspended all field activities pending investigation. The incident prompted a review of safety protocols across primate research facilities in the region. Erica Winslow's story served as a sobering reminder that even our closest relatives in the animal kingdom remain wild and unpredictable.
October 3, 2018 brought crystal clear conditions to the waters surrounding Isla Guadalupe, Mexico. The remote island, located 150 miles off the Baja California coast, offered some of the clearest water and most predictable great white shark encounters on the planet. Visibility extended over 150 feet in the deep blue water, and the water temperature held steady at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. David Chen, 33, had been looking forward to this night shoot for months, knowing that documenting nocturnal great white behavior could revolutionize understanding of these apex predators. David was an award-winning underwater cinematographer whose work had appeared in National Geographic documentaries and major motion pictures. His passion for shark behavior had led him to specialize in great white footage, and he had spent 5 years filming at Guadalupe Island without incident. He had thousands of hours of great white footage and worked exclusively with the most established and safety-conscious operators in the business. Isla Guadalupe had become the premier destination for great white shark encounters due to its unique geography and marine ecosystem. This topography, combined with abundant seal colonies and nutrient-rich currents, creates perfect conditions for great white sharks. Waters around Guadalupe host one of the largest concentrations of great whites in the world. The great white sharks of Guadalupe are among the largest and most impressive specimens of their species. At 8:30 p.m., David was filming from a specially designed night cage, part of a National Geographic project documenting nocturnal great white behavior that had never been captured on film before. The cage was constructed of reinforced aluminum bars with emergency release mechanisms designed to prevent entrapment if the structure became damaged. David was using cutting-edge equipment, including a new high-intensity LED array that produced 12,000 lumens, significantly brighter than any underwater lighting system previously used for shark filming. Great white sharks are primarily visual hunters that rely heavily on their eyesight to locate and attack prey. What David didn't anticipate was how the intense artificial lighting would affect a massive 17-foot male great white that had been hunting in the area. Great whites have evolved to hunt in specific light conditions, and the powerful LED array began to disorient and agitate the already territorial predator. The artificial lighting disrupted the shark's natural hunting behavior, creating confusion and stress that manifested as increasingly aggressive behavior. The 17-foot male great white, weighing approximately 3,800 pounds, had been patrolling the waters around Guadalupe for several days. This was a mature, experienced predator that had successfully hunted in these waters for years. Male great whites of this size are incredibly territorial and aggressive, especially when their normal behavior patterns are disrupted. Great white sharks possess a complex nervous system that processes visual information with remarkable efficiency. Their brains are specifically adapted to interpret the subtle light patterns and shadows that indicate the presence of prey. When exposed to artificial lighting of extreme intensity, their visual processing system can become overwhelmed, leading to disorientation and aggressive behavior. The shark started exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, repeatedly ramming the cage with tremendous force. Each impact sent shockwaves through the water and caused the entire cage structure to shake violently. The aluminum bars, designed to withstand the force of a great white attack, began to show stress fractures under the repeated impacts. David continued filming, believing that the cage would protect him from the agitated predator. Great white sharks can generate incredible force when attacking. Their torpedo-shaped bodies, powered by massive tail muscles, can accelerate from 0 to 25 miles per hour in seconds. Shark's behavior became increasingly frenzied as the bright lights continued to disorient its visual system. What should have been a controlled observation session was rapidly deteriorating into a dangerous confrontation between human technology and one of nature's most perfect predators. When David tried to adjust his lighting setup to reduce the shark's agitation, he accidentally triggered the cage's emergency release mechanism, a safety feature designed to prevent entrapment if the cage became damaged during an attack. The top section of the cage opened, creating a 3-foot gap that the massive shark immediately exploited. Great whites are incredibly intelligent predators with excellent spatial awareness. The shark recognized the opening instantly and adjusted its attack pattern to take advantage of the breach in David's defenses. The agitated great white, drawn by the intense lights and David's movements, attacked through the opening with explosive force. This 17-foot individual was already in an excited, aggressive state, and its attack carried the full force of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The shark's massive jaws, measuring over 18 inches across, clamped down on David's torso with devastating force. The 300 triangular, serrated teeth sliced through his diving equipment and deep into his chest and shoulders. The bite force of 1,800 psi crushed ribs and punctured vital organs, while the shark's brief thrashing motion caused additional trauma as it attempted to drag its prey from the compromised cage. The attack lasted only seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. David's underwater camera continued recording throughout the encounter, capturing footage that would later be used to analyze the incident and improve safety protocols. The images showed the incredible power and speed of a great white attack, as well as the devastating effectiveness of their primary weapon. The boat crew immediately cut all lights and activated emergency protocols, and the sudden darkness seemed to calm the shark, which released its grip and disappeared into the depths as quickly as it had appeared. But the damage was done. David had sustained catastrophic injuries to his cardiovascular and respiratory systems. He was recovered within 90 seconds, a remarkably fast response time that demonstrated the professionalism of the dive crew. But the great white's attack had severed major arteries and crushed vital organs. Despite immediate first aid and emergency medical procedures, David was bleeding internally at a rate that made survival impossible. David died from blood loss and shock before the support vessel could reach the mainland, his final moments captured on the very cameras he had used to document the ocean's apex predators. The footage he had been recording became evidence in the investigation that followed, providing unprecedented insight into great white behavior under artificial lighting conditions. This tragic incident led to new protocols limiting light intensity for all-night filming operations with great whites and requiring backup safety systems for cage diving operations. The investigation revealed that high-intensity artificial lighting could trigger aggressive behavior in great whites, transforming controlled observation sessions into deadly encounters.
It was September 19, 2017, in Limpopo Province, South Africa. The bush stretched flat and dry in every direction, thorn trees casting thin shadows across red earth, the morning air still carrying the last of the night's cool before the heat came in properly. Carol Weston, 57, had waited 20 years for this trip. Her ex-husband had never wanted to go, and she had shelved it the way people shelve things. They stop believing they will ever actually do. The divorce had changed that calculation. She had booked the safari 4 months after the papers were signed. posted about it extensively on social media, and arrived at the reserve 3 days earlier with new camera equipment. She had owned for 3 weeks, and a confidence built on 2 YouTube documentaries and 1 previous visit to a Florida wildlife park. The night before her flight, she had posted a caption that read, "Finally doing it for me." 34 people had liked it by the time she landed in Johannesburg. She had found things to criticize from the moment the vehicle left the gate. The seat she had been assigned was too far from the viewing side. The vehicle moved too slowly at the first sighting. The guide kept too much distance from the animals. She told the couple seated beside her that the operation felt amateur compared to what she had read about Kenyan safaris. She had never been to Kenya, and this is the part that gets me every time. She had never been to Kenya. She was comparing a real safari to one she had read about on the internet. The guide was Dumi, with 9 years of experience at the reserve. He answered her complaints without reacting to her tone and kept the vehicle moving on. Schedule. I respect guides like Dumi. After 9 years in the bush, he still managed someone like Carol without losing his composure. That is genuinely hard to do. The Pride was sighted at approximately 35 meters. 7 lions in total, 4 females, 2 subadults, and 1 dominant male. Large, mature, and documented in prior reserve reports as responsive to elevated movement above vehicle level. A dominant male lion's primary behavioral role within a pride is boundary enforcement. Any movement perceived as intrusion registers as a threat. Dumi positioned the vehicle at a controlled viewing distance and told all passengers clearly to remain seated and keep their movements low. Exiting the vehicle at any point during a game drive was prohibited. It had been explained before the drive began. Carol stood up immediately. She said she could not get a clear shot from a seated position and that she was almost done. Dumi told her to sit. She kept shooting. He told her again, more, firmly. She told him she had paid for the experience and turned back toward the lions. Her upper body was fully above the vehicle profile, her movement clearly visible against the open scrub behind her. What gets me is that Dumi told her twice before she even climbed down. Twice. And she told him she had paid for the experience, as if the lion was going to honor her booking. The dominant male's head turned toward the vehicle, his ears angled back, his body weight shifted forward onto his front legs. Dumi read the posture immediately and told everyone to stay down and not move. Carol looked at the lion, looked at her camera screen, and decided the angle still was not right. She climbed down from the vehicle and stepped onto the ground despite the standing rule, one that had been explained before the drive even began. Dumi's voice changed. Get back in the vehicle, now. She held up one hand toward him and raised her camera. The lion was already moving. The charge covered the distance, with no pause and no warning sound. Carol had no time to turn back toward the vehicle. The lion hit her at full speed and drove her to the ground with his full weight behind the impact. He pinned her and bit down on her neck and upper body, the force of the bite crushing through tissue and bone. The attack lasted only seconds. Dumi activated the emergency beacon and kept the other passengers down inside the vehicle. Response teams used deterrent fire to push the lion back before anyone could approach on foot. Carol Weston was confirmed dead at the scene. Investigators discovered the victim exited the vehicle, triggering immediate predatory lion attack after ignoring guide instructions. She was buried privately with her ex-husband in attendance. Her last social media post had received 34, but she never got to see them. It was September 15, 2017, and the Western Ghats had been under monsoon rains. For weeks, the forest floor turned to dark, compressed leaf rot, the canopy holding water long after the clouds moved through. The kind of terrain where the distance between something hidden and something visible is almost nothing. Arjun Pillai, 52, from the Palakka district of Kerala, had spent nearly 2 decades operating at the edges of the wildlife trade. His wife had died years earlier. His 2 older children had moved away. Neighbors described him as quiet and rarely employed in any legitimate sense. What sustained him financially was a network of brokers who paid well for live reptiles, juvenile king cobras in particular, which moved easily through underground markets in Southeast Asia. He had made this kind of trip dozens of times and returned without incident, and I think that record had long since hardened into something resembling certainty. He brought his son, Kavi, 16, likely for practicality. The boy was quiet, could carry collection bags, and knew not to ask unnecessary questions. Kavi had accompanied him on 2 prior trips without protest. This morning he protested. He said the undergrowth near the nest looked disturbed. He said they should turn back. Arjun did not respond. The forest in the Western Ghat during late monsoon is dense enough to conceal anything at ground level. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes in the world, capable of exceeding 10 to 12 feet. Unlike nearly all other species, they construct nests and actively guard them. A nest-guarding adult will not retreat. The venom is potent, capable of causing severe neurotoxic paralysis in humans. In untreated adult humans, death can occur, but documented fatalities generally develop over 1 to several hours. Forest Department rangers had circulated informal warnings to nearby villages the prior week following a confirmed sighting in the same buffer zone. A retired forest watcher who knew Arjun had told him directly that the area was active and that 2 local men had already abandoned the trail. Arjun apparently nodded and said nothing. That morning, less than 20 yards from the nest site, Kavi spotted a shed skin caught in the lower brush, nearly translucent, intact, longer than either of them. He stopped. Arjun stepped over it and kept moving. At the nest, a compressed mound of decaying vegetation pressed against a granite outcrop. Arjun crouched and peered into the undergrowth. He told Kavi to hold the bag open. He reached his right arm into the brush. Now I know he's been in this trade for a long time, but reaching an arm into a snake's den? Has he just been lucky until this moment? The cobra raised its hood and made a brief hissing display before striking. It struck across the forearm just below the elbow. The impact was audible. He recoiled briefly, but then grabbed the snake, likely in a panicked attempt to control it. It struck 2 more times, once on the right index finger, once across the palm. He swung his machete, repeatedly, eventually severing the snake in sections. The detached head lay in the leaf litter, jaw moving reflexively. Kavi said that he was stunned, unsure how to react, because this is the first time this ever happened. At first, they started hauling the eggs to the bag, but within minutes, swelling tracked visibly up the forearm toward the elbow. Arjun lowered himself to the ground. Kavi stood watching his father. Then he ran. He sprinted nearly 2 miles through wet, uneven terrain to the nearest paved road and flagged down a passing truck, which drove him to the village. Villagers reached the nest site approximately 1 to 1.5 hours after the first strike. Arjun was supine and unresponsive. The severed snake, the machete, and 3 visible bite sites on his right arm and hand established the sequence of events. He later died at the village clinic. Cause of death was severe neurotoxic envenomation, leading to acute respiratory failure, consistent with king cobra. Multiple bite wounds on the right forearm, right index finger, and right palm. Arjun was buried without a formal service. The Forest Department filed an incident report noting the poaching equipment recovered at the scene: collection bags, a wire snare, and 2 plastic transport containers. With the offender deceased, no charges were pursued. Kavi Pillai was taken in by his maternal uncle in Coimbatore. A welfare program affiliated with the Kerala Forest Department helped cover his schooling costs. He sat his secondary exams in 2019, passed, and enrolled that autumn in an electrical trades program at a polytechnic college in Thrissur. I think that if his father was still alive, Kavi wouldn't be given this opportunity.